Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Tom. Tom, I didn't know this was going to be a controversial episode, but apparently this is more controversial than the vaccine talks that I've done with some of the most controversial figures. But apparently the topic of climate is something where I just go like, I want to talk, like I've talked to a lot of people recently about renewable energies. I think after your first appearance on, I dived down the renewable energy rabbit hole. Every single person, it seems like there's multiple people running one race. There's people I've talked from fossil fuels, I talked from electricity, I talked from solar, I've talked to air, and I'm willing to go risk the gambit again. But everyone has the same problem in mind, which is the idea that we need to find a more sustainable energy source. The people from fossil fuel think that this is it. My whole thing is, I mean, if everyone talked about it, but everyone only sees it from their angle, I think there's a combination of things you have to use. I think you can't just cut off fossil fuels in general because it's been this main thing that's been going in our country for a very long time. But it doesn't mean you also can't make other options available as well, too. And that's what I would take into this when people if someone calls me a climate denier, I'm not a climate denier. I'm more on the aspect I'm a climate realist, where I just go, there's definitely issues that we can work on and do better for like a long progressive haul. But this idea that you need to do everything right now because the earth is going to die tomorrow is something I just don't subscribe to. I see it get pushed a lot in media. And I think it's the same thing where I'm not even going to bring up like conspiracy stuff, but I think if you don't fit the narrative or you don't push the narrative, you necessarily aren't incentivized to. I feel like if you report on electric car stuff, you do all this, you might get some money, you might get some type of attention in articles, you might be able to go sit and ask the president exclusive questions about this certain topic. It's the same thing, and I'm going to relate it to this, which is JFK. If you look into like the JFK stuff, like, and I've talked to some of the top researchers involved in it, if you look into that, all the people, and there was a guy named Robert Feynman who worked for ABC, or is it CBS, one of these news networks, who came out and had an exclusive statement talking about if they didn't agree with the Warren Commission, like there was just a lot of people seemed scared. There was a bunch of people that worked for these news stations that would literally say, we're not going to go against the Warren Commission. Now, the Warren Commission's the official report. From the experts I've talked to, the news networks that only agreed with the official narrative, they got exclusive interviews with people, witnesses at the assassination, exclusive witnesses and exclusive people that worked on the case in private. You're just incentivized to go with the mainstream. And that's what we see with today. If you push the idea, and if you're an academic as well, too, which I've talked to plenty, they've told me off air something different than what they've said on air. And that's, yeah, the earth is, a concern, but it's not what everyone's saying it is. It's a way that you can slowly make adjustments and fix the overall problem, not this drastic cutoff. And I think that's in the same court I swing in, and it's the same court you swing in.
Yes. Yep, I completely agree. Yeah, and I have zero problem with people investigating other forms of alternative energy. Or I think they should just all compete in a level playing field, and let's see who wins. Like nuclear, there's a lot of positives about nuclear, but I would like, instead of the government trying to force us one way to try to prevent bad weather, I'd think let the free market mostly decide when the switchover is going to happen from fossil fuels to something else. Yeah.
Do you think people are being pushed to, I guess, go with what the government says because it's the government and people just think the government has the answers to everything?
I do think that's a big part of it. I don't know what part of that, but they definitely control a lot of research funding, so that if they believe, which they do, the Biden administration believes that we're experiencing a climate crisis, they're definitely going to fund the research in that direction. And they're certainly not going to fund somebody like Willie Soon as an example of a guy who pushes back against it. It's going to be harder for him to get funding and to get published than someone on the other side.
What do you think the goal is of just pushing for funding about something that it seems like I mean, I think we all live on this earth, but if you're asking me that the government cares about the sanctity of our earth, I just kind of go like, I don't think so. Like, I think it's something a little bit different. I just don't know what it is.
Yeah, I do not know what it is either. I believe some people inside the government actually believe they're doing the right thing and they're saving human civilization by doing this. And I think other people might have ulterior motives of other kinds. I don't know what. I mean, there's so much money to be made by these alternative solutions, so that if you can get the government to believe that we have to invest in something other than fossil fuels, there's a lot of money that can flow that way. So I'm sure that's part of it, but I don't know overall what's happening.
I think that there's been a giant miscommunication with it. If you look at energy.gov, I think they now just made nuclear energy one of these green energies, which
Oh,
it's weird because Germany, I think for like the past couple of years, has been trying to shut down all their nuclear facilities. And then now, after they shut it all down, they're like, oh, we're going to make nuclear energy part of that green energy initiative. And Germany's like, what? Like we just spent all this time and money shutting this down. Where it's weird how this topic has gotten into like the political side, and it's just weird how this side has become so divisive, where you'll literally get death threats. I mean, I got an email saying that how dare I platform someone who was a climate. I wouldn't call you a skeptic. I wouldn't call you any of that stuff because skeptic just sounds like it sounds conspiracy, even though it's about like rooting out the truth. I would just consider you a realist in some aspects. I think you come at it with a rational angle on some things.
okay. I appreciate it. Whatever you want to call me is totally fine.
Okay.
Climate skeptic is fine. Realist. Denier, I'm not a huge fan of being called a climate denier because, again, I think that is a way to try to paint someone as a Holocaust denier and just this totally evil person. I think that's part of the reason that they use the term denier so much. But I do agree with you, that, as we mentioned before, that humans for sure have some impact on the climate, but also butterflies do, and every living thing on Earth has some effect on the climate. The whole question is how big is that effect, and is it a negative effect, et cetera. And humans do things to both warm and cool the climate, depending on what we're doing. And in the 1970s, it was argued in scientific papers that our net effect on the climate was cooling, not warming. That's because the Earth was cooling then, and now since it switched over to warming since the 70s, then the alleged consensus has switched over that the net effect of humans is now supposed to be warming. That might switch back if we go into another cooling period, which we might. I don't know.
I mean, is it able to be graphed in a sense where you're able to check what the, I guess, the time period is for warming and cooling?
Yeah. There's a bunch of graphs, and we have instrumental records that go back maybe to the late 1800s or so that are relatively reliable. But then as you go back way before that, then they're using proxies to try to draw a graph of what the temperatures look like. But as you go further back in time, I think the graph gets less and less reliable because it's incredibly hard to figure out using tree rings, for example. It's very hard to figure out exactly how warm the Earth was by looking at tree stumps or any other proxies.
Was there a drastic change or some type of drastic evidence that has people thinking that there's a giant human-made factor that like we're I mean, in a sense, if we say, yeah, humans are changing their environment, that's what we do. In some aspects, there's terraforming, like being able to, make it's not necessarily that we're warming the whole entire earth, all this. I think it's a multitude of factors. To say it's just one kind of seems like they've been shown something that has like maybe it's looking up at a coal factory and seeing black smoke and I guess it's visible. So you're like, oh my God, that has to be doing something damaging. But I mean, there's plenty of other countries that are doing the same exact thing. It's not just America, and America seems to be the only one that's taken this giant like cut everything off initiative.
Yeah, the big assumption that I hear very often seems to be that it was cold around 1850 or so, right around that period. The Earth was cold, and that's kind of around when the Industrial Revolution started, and then it warmed after that point. So people are saying, hey, there's a correlation there. Since the Industrial Revolution happened, it got warmer, and that is true. But I don't think the Industrial Revolution caused that warming. I was just reading some of the ClimateGate emails that we can get to later, and some of the internal people there were saying that that century might have been the coldest century for thousands and thousands of years. So the Earth had been cooling, and it was cold right then around 1850 naturally. And I think it would have warmed up very much between then and now if humans never existed. I think it just happened to be that the Industrial Revolution happened then, and it didn't happen exactly at 1850. I believe the warming since then was probably mostly natural. But anyway, that's one of the biggest things is that, look, it's warm since we started burning a lot of coal, therefore the coal produced the warming. But the climate has fluctuated all over the place so many different times, and nobody really understands all those fluctuations, and we can't just assume that this one was caused by us.
Well, like even when the dinosaurs were around, there were no polar ice caps. If you look at anybody who's a paleontologist or geologist who studied anything that what I would say prehistory before we came to be, when the dinosaurs were around, it was just they would call the climate dry and hot. There was green, luscious life everywhere, way greener than it is now, and that was because the number of carbon molecules were way more than it is now. And it's an inconvenient truth for a lot of people that talk about carbon emissions, is that there is more plant life and it does increase because plants do live off carbon dioxide. It's not necessarily good for human life, but we're all made of carbon. And that's when it gets really tricky when you look at the legal language that's in a lot of these documents when they start banning things of carbon. You don't necessarily know. It's kind of like an umbrella term. That can mean multiple things. That can mean fucking trees. That can mean anything.
Right, right. They say carbon because they want you to think of black carbon making things dirty. And also they want you maybe to think of carbon monoxide, that if there's too much of that in your garage, you're going to die. But anyway, what we're talking about here in terms of climate impact, they're talking about carbon dioxide, and that's colorless and it's harmless, it's natural. And Patrick Moore argues that the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was going down for a long time, until recently when humans started burning more fossil fuels. It was getting dangerously low. And some people think if it got down to maybe 180 parts per million, that global plant life would really struggle in the world. And it was getting down to about 280 or so and continuing to go lower. And Patrick actually argues that us putting more CO2 has kind of saved the living things on Earth, because the living things do so much better at higher CO2. And back when the dinosaurs were around, it might have been more like 4,000 or 5,000 parts per million instead of today's 420. So the whole idea that it's way too high now is just ridiculous. Life was totally flourishing when CO2 was way higher than it is now.
Well, see, when you say the words flourishing, people don't think that when they think climate change. They think fires, they think burning.
Yep, yep. They think of all these negative things that are allegedly caused by heat, but I've looked carefully back at what they were telling us in the 1970s, and pretty much every bad thing that they say is going to happen now because of warmth, they were saying it was happening then because of cold. And so that cold weather, cold climate was going to cause more drought. It's going to cause more flooding, probably more fires, going to cause crop failures. So supposedly 1970s, getting dangerously cold, but all of a sudden now, allegedly, it's getting dangerously warm, but the same effects of that cold are now blamed on warming. But a major point is that droughts continue to happen, whether it's cold or warm, and droughts, floods, bad weather, et cetera. It's happening. It always has happened, always will happen. And the whole idea that by tweaking CO2 up or down, we're going to be able to change the amount of bad weather or how destructive the bad weather is, that's not going to happen that way.
Well, the big issue is that it doesn't just affect people's everyday lives. It affects like supply chain issues as well too. When you're doing cutoffs and you're just pushing towards everyone getting electronic vehicles, or everyone getting some type of electric energy source being the main kind of distributor out there, especially in a society that really isn't set up for that. And I think people can notice that now, which is gas is now $6. Now they blame it on the war going on in Ukraine, but also I think that's very, very kind of suspect, considering that I've seen it drop, considering when like my state governor took out gas tax, it dropped by almost like $2. And you're like, how much are you profiting off of just raising the prices up? And the weird part is how quickly we adjust to it as well, too.
Yeah, I don't think it's that war. I think Biden's war against fossil fuels, I think that has made a big difference, that he's done everything he can. He said that when he was campaigning, that he was going to fight fossil fuels. I think he promised to some people at some campaign stops that he was going to end fossil fuels. And so if you're trying to cut off our supply, then prices are going to go up. So that it seems like he's changed his tune, because gas prices are up so high, and now he's saying it's your patriotic duty for refineries to produce more gas. So he's really flipped over on that one. And yeah, I think it's so unpopular. Gas prices are so unpopular with voters that he almost had to flip over on that one.
Well, why? But people, if we talk about like getting a Republican in office or something like that, you think that would change, or do you think we would still be spitting out the same narrative? Like, I just don't see the incentive for one person like Biden to be able to, just say, oh, we got to cut off fossil fuels, unless you're trying to get votes. But I don't know how large the majority of people that don't want fossil fuels are. I think everyone hates gas being this high up. I think that's what's making him a very disliked person right now.
Yeah, but he does have tons of people in his administration that are saying things on Twitter and elsewhere that there is a climate crisis and we have to do everything we can right now to switch over. And they're saying it's an opportunity for us to switch over right now to electric vehicles, which is very interesting. I wanted to mention that I just saw some announcement someplace where there's possible looming blackouts in California because of problems with electricity generation, possibly. And one bit of advice they're giving is don't charge your electric vehicle. So even the electric vehicles that are now in California, they're worried that they won't have enough electricity to charge them all. So this whole idea that we're all going to switch over to electric vehicles and we're going to be able to charge all of them overnight with our current infrastructure, there's no way we could do that even if we wanted to anytime soon. We just don't have the ability to suddenly move from gas to electricity and do all that transport via electricity.
Well, it was like when they made that field that was filled with a bunch of solar panels, but apparently the field flooded and ruined every single one of the solar panels. Like they just they weren't prepared for it. They were thinking too far ahead and didn't take account for the rain and all the flooding that would happen in that specific area where they built these solar panels. Where I just go like, I think when you put a fast pace or you put a cutoff on something like fossil fuels or any of these types of things, necessarily you might not be wrong, but I just think you got to think what like it's all slow adjustments over time. We can incorporate a lot of stuff. We can do beneficial good stuff. The weirdest thing that I saw was that they're going to start genetically modifying cows to fart less.
Oh, is that true? I think I may have seen something about that.
I just talked to
yeah.
someone about the supply chain and I brought this up and he goes, this is freaking nuts because he's worried about contaminants in the supply chain and in the food industry. He's a food scientist. So he starts talking. I brought this up to him and he's like, that's a really big fear. And it's like, I don't get people's brains sometimes where it's like, why would you, that just doesn't seem like we're going to get that fixed, that whole cow fart scenario. And then they say it's cow burps as well, too.
Okay, I was thinking of something else maybe because I've seen multiple times where they're doing experiments where they have a big tank attached to a cow's back and the tank is supposed to capture the burps of the cow somehow. I don't know if it was just for testing or if they wanted to roll that out and capture all the burps, but they actually had tanks on the back. And then I've seen many a time that they're talking about, hey, if you give your cows seaweed, they're going to fart and burp less. So I don't know how practical that would be. You got a herd of cows here in Minnesota. If you're going to feed them seaweed, how practical it is to harvest it and transport it here and get them to eat it just so that they burp less. It seems pretty outrageous.
Well, where
ridiculous.
Whoever's thinking of these, what evidence are they seeing that's showing that? Like I see a lot of people talk about fires, and I think we talked about it on your episode as well too. A lot of fires that happened. They did a poll from 2001 to 2019 with a lot of the California firefighters, especially during that huge issue that we had where there were California fires going on. They talked about that a lot of these fires were man-created fires. It wasn't just because of the heat. It was a combination of things. People being very neglected to their environment when it came to just tossing cigarette butts out their fucking windows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of them were deliberately set, I think. An Antifa guy was charged with that, right?
An Antifa guy tried to trap the firefighters fighting the fires inside the circle by lighting a fire around them. And you got to think that's someone that's teaching your kids.
Yeah, and I think people were looking at those fires that were set by that guy and saying, look, carbon dioxide caused these fires. I think I wouldn't doubt that was used for some propaganda anyway.
So you see the dangers of some aspects when it comes to the idea that like this climate change thing, where I think you need to understand, yes, our climate is always changing. Now, is it how much of it is changing is the thing, and who's the cause of the thing? Is this a natural state of how the earth is that goes in fluctuations and changes? I mean, we've noticed that there's been severe growth in warming periods, but there's not severe growth in cold periods. There's a lot of issues that happen in cold periods, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, you talking about hot and cold individual records, like a daily record?
Like you've seen more human growth aspects when it comes to warm periods in time rather than when you look at cold periods in time.
Yeah, they say that, but I am not convinced at all that's true. If you look really carefully at the records here in the US, we have some of the better records because we have some sites that have good temperature records for a long time. And if you look at the long-term temperature records, for example, here in the US, most of the state high temperature records were set quite some time ago. I don't have it right in front of me, but very few state high temperature records have been set in the last 20 years. A lot of them were set in the 1930s and a long time ago. I think here in Minnesota, our highest temperature was maybe 1918 or something. And there's a lot of that kind of thing, that it was really hot in the US decades ago, before you were born and way before even I was born. It was very hot. So the heat that we're seeing now really doesn't measure up to the propaganda we're seeing now.
So would the high but isn't every year like a hottest temperature or something like that? I feel like every time I turn on the news.
Yeah. Yeah, they say that, and I'm constantly mocking that on Twitter when I'm using the hashtag hottest year ever, because they're constantly selling the idea that the current year is the hottest year ever, but it's not. That is propaganda, because the temperature is fluctuating up and down globally and locally. And I think some of the best global temperature records, temperature data that we have is from the UAH satellite data, where there's no local urban heat islands or anything. It's not the temperature records from the ground, it's from up in the satellite. I think that's more reliable. And that is showing that since 2015, the Earth has been cooling. So it's not like every single year since 2015 got a little warmer. It's that 2015 was warm, and every year since then, pretty much, or most years since then, have been colder than 2015. So it goes up and down. Nobody really knows why, but the whole idea that we're adding CO2 each year, therefore it's warmer each year, that is absolutely not what is happening.
Do you think it's people are making the correlation that with the number of productivity that's gone up since maybe these periods of cold that we've had, and that's why that the heat's going up as well too?
Because of human changes in human activity,
Yeah.
or I mean
I guess I'm playing
that's
devil's advocate. I'm trying to
yeah,
look at
yeah, that's the idea. Yeah, constantly I'm seeing people look at fluctuations in temperature and then trying to figure out the reason why humans must have caused that. So most people, even climatologists that are on the warmest side, they agree that the Earth warmed leading up to the end of World War II, and then it cooled from the about for 30 years or so, between, let's say, 45 to 75. But they're saying the reason that it cooled is because there was some sort of post-war boom in industrialization. We released more sulfates, and that caused the whole Earth to cool for 30 years. So it's not it was a natural cycle. It went up and then it went down. It's that humans released CO2 until 1945, and then evidently we started releasing sulfates for 30 years after that. And that's their actual. They actually want us to believe that humans caused both the cooling before 45, or the warming before 45, and the cooling after that. But they end up tying themselves in knots, because they end up charging the same coal station with both causing warming before 45, and then all of a sudden those coal stations are producing cooling after that. So my major point here is they're trying to blame humans for every fluctuation, but I think it's extremely likely that humans have some effect, but these big fluctuations are caused by something other than humans.
like solar flares too.
Yeah, there's all sorts of things going on. There's solar activity. There's a guy named Nir Shaviv that has done great work on how solar activity changes cloudiness on Earth. And I think that's a huge thing that needs to be understood, that we do not understand, is how the general cloudiness on Earth changes a lot, and we don't know why.
Do
And
you
that affects temperature.
do you hear a lot of suggestions when it comes to weather manipulation? Like I know a lot of people talk about like HARP, that one government organization that's designed to like figure out ways to be able to manipulate weather in a sense. I mean, it leads down more of a conspiracy rabbit hole where people talk about like being able to terraform the weather, being able to stop hurricanes and stuff. It's called cloud seeding and things of that sort. But to think that they haven't found ways to be able to maybe adjust certain temperatures. I mean, there's theories being tossed about it around, or at least around about it all the time.
Yeah, I think you would know a lot more about that than I would. I have not really delved into that. I have heard of some weather modification that China might have done before the Olympics to cause lack of rain during sports events or something, but I don't know about that. There was another guy I was just reading about that sometime in the last 10 years put a lot of iron in seawater. I think he was going to try to do something to modify the weather by producing or putting enormous amounts in a small area of, I think it was iron into seawater to adjust the amount of plankton and maybe suck in more CO2 or something. There's all these ideas. Maybe Bill Gates is going to have some idea to use some sort of mirrors to reflect sunlight and things like that.
Well,
I don't know if any testing's been done, but anyway.
they were talking about that with the James Webb Telescope of being able to maybe adjust it to maybe cool the Earth by a couple degrees.
Yeah, yeah, and I would think that would just be a terrible idea. I think to cool the Earth by a couple of degrees would for sure be worse for humans than not doing that. The idea that cooling would be helpful, no way.
Well, I spoke with someone who studies hydro power, and they talked about how there was ideas out there of being able to fertilize the oceans to produce more oxygen from like all the little microorganisms that are inside the ocean.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard ideas. I don't know if anyone is actually going to put that into practice, but don't know.
Because I mean, it's the same thing with like what is it, carbon capture, where you're able to contain some of that carbon. But from all we know right now is we do it with trees, and the trees, if they end up getting burned or something, then it releases all that stored carbon into the. So it's just an issue that we end up dealing with later. It's not something that we deal with right now.
Yeah, funny you should mention that about trees, because I was just looking back at something that there was a paper, a peer-reviewed paper about 10 years ago, where their solution to global warming was to have, I believe, to pay 1 million people full time to go out with chainsaws, et cetera, cut down trees and dig big trenches and bury them. That was their idea, to just keep doing that, to cut down trees, because there's a lot of carbon that's stored in those in that wood. So if you just cut down trees like crazy and bury them underground, then you're kind of reversing the whole fossil fuel thing, and you're putting carbon back where it belongs underground, and you're taking it out of the air. So that was their actual idea, that we're going to try to cool the planet by doing that. And I think that is one of the craziest ideas I've seen, but it was a peer-reviewed paper, got through it somehow.
How many of these kind of dangerous scenarios are just environmentalists trying to prove a point?
Good point. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. Maybe they weren't serious with that. Maybe they were. I don't know what they were thinking, but they.
Yeah, but it seems like they're trying to do something beneficial in their eyes, which is warn people about the climate crisis. But then the way that they're trying to promote that is by trying to ramp it up to the extreme to people take action now.
Yeah, that could be. Maybe you're right. I don't know.
What's Climate Gate?
Climate Gate. Oh, yeah. I spent the morning just looking back at these emails. These were emails that were released by an unknown person. There's like 200,000 emails released in 3 blocks 10 plus years ago. And I think out of outsiders who have read those emails, I think hardly anybody has read more of them than I have. I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours reading all these Climate Gate emails. So there are emails from climate science insiders talking about how they're adjusting the data and how they're manipulating peer review and how they're not trusting the things that their cohorts are saying. There's a lot of internal division. Super interesting to me to just dig into there. And it's a peek behind the curtain to see what was going on for years in the climate science community. And one big point is that what was going on behind the scenes and what they were saying behind the scenes was extremely different from what they were saying in public. It's just a night and day between the picture we had from the outside and what was actually going on inside.
When you say that they were manipulating peer-reviewed articles, do you know how that they were doing that?
Manipulating the data or the peer-reviewed articles?
The peer-reviewed articles, because when I reached out to people to talk about like mining, sustainable mining is an actual thing. There's a way that you can sustainably mine. And you look at the author affiliations, I didn't really trust it because a lot of the studies and papers I was reading were sponsored by Exxon. And it's weird because if you look at Exxon, they have a large track record of influencing like environmental actions and decisions, which is like seems like the opposite of you would expect from a gas company.
Yeah, the stuff I was looking at in ClimateGate is super interesting to me in that there's 2 different guys, McIntyre and McKittrick, who were debunking the hockey stick. Steve McIntyre, Ross McKittrick. They had a paper. I don't know if this one was debunking the hockey stick, but somewhere in that arena. And to peer review that one, they had Phil Jones supposedly peer reviewing it. And he was like their direct opposite on the other side of the argument. So you have 2 people on the opposite side of a scientific debate, and you want one side to win. So you have your side peer review the other one and just say, no, we're not going to let this paper through. And then if Phil Jones himself on the warmer side wants to get a paper peer reviewed, it's very easy. They could just call it PAL review. So you can just have one of Phil Jones's friend review it, rubber stamp it, and it gets published. But then if someone on the other side, they have a paper that they want published, then now it's Phil Jones saying, no, you can't publish it. So it's just the whole idea that a peer reviewed paper is truth, and one that isn't peer reviewed must have got rejected because it had problems. That's not the way it's been working. It's way more of a political thing than a scientific thing in what I've been reading in these emails.
Well, you're also not incentivized to do research that doesn't fit that climate. Like if you're going to research about the climate, it better be in the direction that they want you to research it. And you're not going to get funding for researching something that's against what they don't want you to research in.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. But the whole idea that Steve McIntyre, he just did fantastic work. He is a very, very good at statistical analysis, way better than the insiders doing the hockey stick were at doing statistics. So statistical expert says there's problems. And Phil Jones, you can tell he doesn't really understand what's happening, but he's in charge of saying, is McIntyre's work correct or not? And Phil said no, basically. So very interesting stuff anyway.
Have you seen any recent like changes in maybe climate since we last talked?
Changes in the climate debate.
Yeah.
Or yeah, one thing I'm continuing to notice is I think a lot of the debate is actually happening over social media and on Twitter, et cetera. A lot of the important debate where people will put up scientific claims and it gets debunked far quicker by a whole wide range of people right away on social media. Whereas I think it's the way the old time peer review was done. It's there's so many problems with it, and it's all happening behind closed doors, and it takes forever. I think this whole idea that is the way we determine scientific truth. I think it's really changing with uh, with the chance to air things over the internet and let everybody look at it right away and let everybody just tear it apart or validate it right away. I just really like to see it done in a new way, where instead of just one or two pals reviewing something, you have all sorts of people looking at it, and everybody's coming at it with different perspectives, and they all have different ideas. I think it's just great that there's this open discussion of it.
Well, how do you get to a point where you have someone just asking genuine questions that actually want to know the answer to whatever you just posted, but they get someone that comments below them saying something horrible about don't trust this type of thing, don't do that. And it completely ruins the topic. Like when I invite you on the show, I'm generally interested into the topic of it and trying to see your perspective through it. I got an email from a potential guest that told me that was like, you should have pressed harder on them. You should have had this. And I'm like, is it my job to tell some or debate someone like that? I haven't seen a debate done properly, and they never answered me back. And that person was a fucking therapist. So you got to look at that like, what the hell kind of science is that? Where I go, you want this, especially a topic that is climate change, and if it is as important as people are saying it is, that are on the other side as well too, saying that we need to do something right now or the world's going to die, then you shouldn't make it to something where it turns into a giant argument where you just fight on Twitter all day. It should be something where there's actual successful ground being done as well too, where I just start going, does anybody have any renewable energy suggestions? And nobody suggests jack. Nobody has an answer to the renewables question. So I go, do you think maybe we don't have an answer as a concept of we can't get over our own 2 feet about it?
Mhm. Yeah, so I just love the rough and tumble actually of the social media, and just everybody get out there and just say what you really think, and let's hash it out. Let's right now let's hash it out. And I would love the idea. Maybe on your show at some point I can debate somebody on the other side. I would love that because I have zero problem debating because I'm confident that the data is on the skeptical side. But this whole idea of let's not hurt anybody's feelings and let's just go with the flow and pretend that this fraudulent stuff is true, just so it's just so much easier to do that. I don't like that approach. I think life is short, and I think we should just try to find out the truth the best way we can. And if it gets heated and argumentative, I'm 100% okay with that. I think the truth, finding the truth, is super important, because if we don't, if we make stupid energy choices because we're trying to prevent bad weather, people are actually going to die. With if there's blackouts, and if we prevent people in Africa from getting fossil energy so that they can run their hospitals and schools, and that's very bad for real people. And again, people can die and have much worse lives. So I think we should just find the truth, and if anyone's feelings get hurt, that's the way it goes. But the truth is so important.
Well, the issue is that what truth are we talking about here? Because when people start, like when you pull up data on the show, and then when someone else pulls up data, you guys both have data on it. Which data is the correct thing? And then you got people in the general public that are trying to sort through the information to be able to decipher which one is the truth. There are people that'll agree with you, and there are people that'll agree with the other side. I'm kind of trying to stay in the middle, and it seems like a subject that I'm being forced on either one or the other side of things. And I think there's a reasonable discussion that needs to be had and needs to be made, but there's also not anybody willing to accept debates depending on what side you're on.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think everybody should pull up any data they have on their side and argue their points and use as much logic and data, and make the strongest case they can. And the best arguments and data should win. And it is difficult in climate to just figure out exactly what really is happening. There's all sorts of arguments all over the place about what is more important, how important are volcanoes, and how important is the changes in cloudiness. And there's all this stuff happening, and nobody on Earth knows the actual answer to how Earth's climate works. I bet 50 years from now, nobody will know exactly how it works, as it's so incredibly complicated. And as I mentioned before, the whole idea of trying to model the climate and get all the variables right and all the interactions right and get the initial state right is just way harder than we can manage yet. I don't know when we'll ever understand it. But I don't know, somebody was talking about it's very hard, even with a very simple problem like you have a roulette wheel and you're trying to figure out how that ball is going to bounce and where exactly it's going to land. Just figuring that out is incredibly hard to model that correctly. And then the orders of magnitude of more complexity in figuring out how the Earth's climate works is just, I don't know how many more orders of complexity of magnitude it is. So much more complex. So anyway, I'm trying to say that arguments are great, and we shouldn't just take anybody's arguments as being correct and move on from there. I think we got to hear from lots of people on this.
I've done that. I think, especially when it comes to people on opposite sides of stuff. I had a guy on who talked about voluntary human extinction movement, which was just don't have kids to save the earth. If mankind just stopped having kids, then you would see the earth start to heal. And I think what really bolsters that point is the fact of when during pandemic and lockdowns, when you heard dolphins and oceans colors starting to come back, especially in Venice. I mean, is there any type of reasonable thing besides that that can prove that point of like, if you do just take a break, will society go into this state of fixing itself or balancing itself out?
Yeah, I think Alex Epstein makes some good arguments about that human flourishing is important. And I forget what he says about like bears do affect the climate somehow, and maybe we should eliminate all bears just so that to eliminate their climate effect. And beavers affect the climate a lot. Every living thing affects the climate. So if we're trying to completely eliminate everything's effect on the climate, then I guess we got to get rid of all life on Earth, not just humans, but everything else. All the trees have an effect on the climate, but it's not necessarily a bad effect. And I think actually Elon Musk has done some arguments recently or mentioned some data about how the Earth is certainly not anywhere near overpopulated right now. He's pushed back against the whole overpopulation thing. But the bottom line is, I have zero confidence that the weather is worse on a planet with 7 billion people than a planet with 1 billion people. I think we could eliminate 90% of the people on Earth, and the weather would not be any worse or any better than it is right now.
Then how do we get into one of these groups, I would say, or how do you get into one of these territories that I always see you tweeting about and hashtagging about called climate cult? How does it get to that level in your head? Because I don't look at them as a climate cult, but I'm guessing you've probably had some interactions that I haven't came across yet.
Yeah, I mean, I've had tons of interactions over the last 15 years, probably with maybe thousands of different people on Twitter. It's been a lot of them. And yeah, I think it has many characteristics of a cult in that there's a religious aspect to it, and there's an idea of devoting your life to this cause without really digging into it much. That's one of the major things, is that I see people who've devoted their life supposedly to this topic without spending even 1 hour looking at the other side to see if they might be wrong. They just have this idea that they're heroes saving the planet, and they're just blindly following their leader. I think there are some people that are blindly following Greta because they think that she is some sort of a Joan of Arc type person.
That's so fucking weird to me. You have a 12-year-old or a 14-year-old, whatever, and the
almost
Congress
20 now.
It seems like a fucking joke when they put her up on the thing. And I get if she's got good ideas, but all she's doing is yelling that you need to do something about the environment now. And like, that's all I've heard in interviews. And it's just like, I mean, is the Supreme Court taking this seriously? Where's like the actual scientists and the lab coats that are supposed to be explaining the data to us, not just someone who says they take a sailboat everywhere?
Yeah, so it's just like a crazy movie that's not real life. That Greta went somewhere, I forget where, there was a lot of well-known world politicians, and they were forming a line so that they could get an audience with Greta and get a picture taken with Greta. I think it's just preposterous that actually happened in real life. That just Greta doesn't know anything really about Earth's climate. I have seen nothing from her that indicates she knows anything about how energy is used or created. And the whole idea that she is some sort of figure, a prophet that politicians should be taking their knowledge from, it's just incredible, but it's happening in real life. And nothing that Greta says is going to make the weather any better. And a lot of things that if she was in charge, I think it would cause enormous amounts of human suffering, because she would have us get rid of fossil fuels without any real ideas of how we're going to live without them.
What do you think would happen if they ended up getting rid of fossil fuels?
I think millions or billions of people would die if we stopped using fossil fuels right now today. If they just pulled the plug on everything and said, okay, let's go without right now, it would be an enormous amount of human misery. we can switch over and eventually use them, but we can't right now because it's just incredibly important to so many things that we're doing right now, to the food chain, our transportation, the way we're running our hospitals and schools, and heating our homes. If you cut fossil fuels off in Minnesota on a real cold day in winter, that would be just incredibly, it would kill lots of people pretty quick. Yeah.
I haven't really seen any suggestion plans of courses of action to take besides the idea that, oh, by 2024, 2025, electric cars will be the only types of vehicles. I haven't seen anything besides that one kind of narrative where I start going, if you want this idea of cutting off fossil fuels, what suggestions do you have that takes its place? Like besides electric, but we have a plenty of other things out there that aren't, the reason why people are scared of nuclear is because of the number of accidents that they've heard about, like Chernobyl's a giant one. They're not necessarily, they don't happen all the time, but we have a lot of nuclear facilities that are way past expiration date when it comes to being like, restructured and looked over. I mean, some of them 30, 35 years past. I don't consider that a nuclear energy issue. I consider that a problem with people being lazy as shit. You have corporate now influencing a lot of things, not just when it comes to research, but when it comes to every single day decisions, and you have the public acting on those decisions. Where I stand at the whole climate topic, I think both sides virtue signal. I think people that say it's like both sides are signaling to their tribe to get their support. But it's weird that we can't just have a discussion about it as well either, where it's got to be like, I got my group of followers and you got your group, and we're just going to kind of yell at each other across the board. Where I go, I mean, there's some real things that we could be implementing. I don't think it necessarily, like I said before, needs to be a complete cutoff, but I think there's a reasonable thing that you can obtain if we just kind of talk about the issues when it comes to it.
Yeah, I would love to see more of that. Maybe you can facilitate some talking back and forth here on your show.
I
I
think
don't know.
some people
Yeah.
associate with, even though I associate to someone on the other side that doesn't fit their narrative, they don't want to be a part of it,
Yeah, they won't even come on their own, right? If you hosted me, for example, yeah,
which is just weird. I just think you might be a little bit too popular.
I don't think that's true, but thank you.
Take the compliment.
Thank you. Yeah, okay.
What do you think about the idea of electric roads that are able to power up these electric vehicles that they were talking about? I know Elon Musk at one point was talking about it.
Yeah, I've read some stuff. I can't remember the details, but I think they've tried it in real life and it was a huge fiasco because the road was getting dirty. I don't know if that's what you're talking about. There was some deal where if it would work if you kept the road completely pristine, but if you got dirt on top of there, then it was causing problems. But is this the road that would charge your vehicle as you drive?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen any evidence that's actually working in practice. I think it's a thing that looks good and maybe on the drawing board, but I don't see that working in practice anytime soon. It doesn't seem like it. I don't know how you keep the road clean enough to do that.
Well, I got one more problem for you. Then I'm going to ask, what problems do you also come across when it comes to like just some like interesting stuff that you might have written about? But when it comes to the idea that people talk about like with the planet warming, that it's going to catch all the fields on fire. Now, we mentioned a lot of fires being created by man, but people are also worried about their food. Like they're worried about that the supply chain and all these things are going to be fluctuating with the amount of massive heat, which is also, I think, a reason why people worry so much about being able to get off fossil fuels, because they link fossil fuels with warming the planet.
Yeah, I don't know if we have time a little later. I got a couple slides on that. But the whole idea that the Earth is on fire now is absolutely not true. If you look at global fires, they've gone down a lot over the last 100 years. So there was tons of fires 100 years ago. So the Earth is not on fire. It's not even getting more fiery than it was. It's getting less fiery than it was. And then you talk about we're worried about crop production, and that is just going way up as well. So the whole idea that crops are producing less per acre now than they were 100 years ago is totally untrue. They're producing way more per acre in almost any way you look at it. The crops are just way more productive. And the whole idea that we're going to starve because of more carbon dioxide in the air, totally not true. I would worry about us starving if we get natural cooling. And I think if we can't grow wheat in Canada anymore, I think that would be a big problem. I think we'll find a way around it, but it would be a negative thing if it happens.
Well, that's what I was trying to tell you about the period of growth when it comes to warming versus cooling. If you look at cooling, there's massive amounts of starvation because the amount of crops that are lost to massive cooling. And if people can't get food, they starve to death. And that's just also a factor. When you're starving, you're more likely to die in the cold. When it comes to warm, though, the weird thing where you see with warmth is you see population increasing, which is like a area of, I would say, growth. in a sense. I've heard this from someone who goes by the younger, driest impact hypothesis that talks about these different periods in the planet, which also brings into the point when it comes to like the dinosaurs, for instance. There were no polar ice caps back then. We've adjusted to this idea of polar ice caps, they're melting. I go, well, we're used to that because all of our human existence, there's been polar ice caps. There's been these Arctic zones. But if you look back when the dinosaurs, when they were here long before we were, before that comet impact, there was none of that. It was all giant green jungles. I mean, it gets to the point where, like, I think a lot of people, a couple generations, my own as well, too, rainforest. That's a man created thing. That's an invasive species that was dropped there. That's not natural. That's not something that was born and that was not something that was just here from Earth. The tropical rainforest was created from a tribe of like Native American people that had these types of seeds that they transferred over. It's this long, like weird backstory, but it makes you rethink about a lot of stuff of what you consider like, is this like, we're worried about this and it's dying. Is it like a weed? Was it even supposed to be here in the first place? Is it going to affect the overall thing? And I think these are all people could say like that sounds crazy. Look it up, but at the same time, these are all like information you need to know about. You can't just shun it because it necessarily doesn't fit what you want.
I think it's interesting you mentioned that as you were talking there. When humans were alive, humans lived through a time when there was a mile of ice covering what is now Chicago. I think it's kind of mind blowing to think that humans were around and the ice, even where I am right now, there was enormous amounts of ice covering current land. So the whole idea that humans can't survive when the ice caps are changing is totally wrong. The ice caps are constantly changing. And I think it was a good thing when the ice cap that covered where I'm sitting right now, when it melted, that wasn't a sad thing that we shouldn't have had a funeral, because they've had funerals for glaciers recently because we're supposed to be so sad if ice melts. But anyway, there was ice right here. Now there's no ice. And, life is flourishing and the ice is going to come back. I think we should enjoy it while it lasts until the ice comes back.
How much do you validate the Smithsonian Magazine? I know they have like a lot of controversial stuff that happens on there.
I don't read it much, but I think Willie Soon has some connection to the Smithsonian. So there's some high profile skeptics that have some Smithsonian connection. Willie Soon and Sally Baliunas, I think. But I don't know. I think they have quite a warmist bias in general. Do you have something right there? Or?
So this article is on Smithsonian Magazine, which says the supposedly pristine, untouched Amazon rainforest was actually shaped by humans. So the way some describe it, you'd think the Amazon was a tangle of woods virtually untouched by human hands. The first Eden of pristine natural kingdom is how Stanwin Shelter, a Smithsonian botanist, described this region of the world in a 1991 book marking the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World. The native people were transparent in the landscape, living as natural elements of the ecosphere. Their world was a world of barely perceptual human disturbance. But was it really? Unless I can't even say that. Scholars in the past quarter century have shown that this mythical image of untouched nature is just a myth. Like humans everywhere, Native Americans shape their environments to suit them through burning, pruning, tilling, and other practices. And the Amazon is no different. Look closer, and you can see the deep impressions that humans have made on the world's largest tropical rainforest. Scientists reportedly yesterday in the Journal of Science, despite its vastness, the Amazon stretches more than 2 million square miles and has an estimated 390 billion trees. This rainforest is hardly the untamable, unstoppable force of nature that the romantics opined, says, and then they name some archaeologist at University of Exeter. In fact, humans have inhabited the Amazon for roughly 13,000 years and have been domesticating plants for at least 8,000 years. Recent archaeological studies, especially in the last 2 decades, show that indigenous populations in the past were more numerous, more complex, and had greater impact on the largest and most biodiverse tropical forest in the world than previously thought. In 2013, community ecologist Hanster Steege and colleagues were taking inventory of the vast diversity of the Amazon trees. The team sampled 1,170 scatter plots far from modern human inhabitants to identify more than 16,000 different species among those 390 billion individual plants. Then they noticed something odd. Despite the broad diversity, over half of the total trees were made up of just 1%, 227 of the species. About 20 of these hyperdominant plants were domesticated species such as the Brazil nut, the Amazon tree grape, and the ice cream bean tree. That was 5 times the amount researchers expected if chance were the only factor. The hypothesis came up that perhaps people might have domesticated these species a lot, which would have helped their abundance in the Amazon. So I heard that from an environmentalist, like an environmental biologist. So I'm just I thought that was an interesting thing because I think a lot of people think that this thing is like natural and 100%. I go, well, mankind has always kind of shaped its landscape, but depending on what range we talk about, right now it's just weird how society thinks of it as we're completely destroying it, which I don't know. I've talked to a lot of people on the other side, some people that stick by the aspect of we need to do something right now, but I just maintain the middle ground where I just go, I think there's a lot about this thing that we're told, and there's a lot of stuff that they say privately. And speaking to a lot of these people privately, they don't voice the same opinions because it's the way that society views it. It's the narrative that's being pushed. I mean, you're going to get more funding for your research if you're an academic that's researching climate change compared to I don't know if you know who Peter Boghossian is.
I don't know.
He's a friend of Michael Shermer's, but he wrote a paper talking about the conceptual penis thing. Now, the conceptual penis study was a fake study where they just talked about how, like, a man with his legs wide open is akin to raping the air around him. And they figured out through all this science and all these studies, and he rattles off a bunch of fake numbers that don't make any sense. But he says that the male reproductive organ is essentially linked to climate change. And the university that he published this at stamped its approval. And he goes, did you even read it? And all he had to do was incorporate key words that society goes by. And that's like sexual orientation, gender. It goes down to all these basic concepts that you hear always talked about and trending all over, Twitter or whatever. It's stuff that the way that society has a viewscape on it, that academia would not fight against that because they're afraid of getting riots protesting at their universities, which I just think is important as well, too, which is also information that probably a lot of people aren't aware of.
Very interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard about that. I mean, going back to that Amazon thing, I had not heard about that either. But I've never been down there. I have no idea what it's really like down there.
You're the climate skeptic. How am I teaching you stuff?
No, you would think I would have been down there, but it makes me think of Patrick Moore, who wrote, I think, Fake Invisible Catastrophes, where they're saying that so much of the global warming propaganda involves people. It's just very far away where normal people never go there. So we just have to take their word for it that there's a catastrophe.
If Patrick is listening, I never emailed him back, and I'm sorry. I missed that.
Okay. Yeah. Hopefully you can get him on here because I've heard him speak in person. He is a very knowledgeable and very good speaker on a lot of these topics. He knows tons about the natural world, and he knows exactly. He knows a lot of arguments about why humans are not the center of everything. A lot of stuff is happening naturally.
Besides agreeing with the narrative, why do you think that a lot of these inconvenient truths, even though there's clear kind of a statement of like there is more plant life than there has ever been? Now, in a lot of those cases, we talk about like really skinny trees. People talk, well, about trees aren't living to these big, beautiful lives anymore. And it's like, yeah, well, we use them as resources now, which I get the environmentalist side on that aspect of things. But there's a lot of little, I would say, not holes, but I would say that they're more inconvenient truths when it comes to the concept of they're not really being talked about. And when someone does learn about it, they're more than happy to deny the evidence of that and keep going with what they're doing. They're not changing their opinion on things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a lot of human interest. Humans are interested in the alleged end of the world, or there's a big problem. I think people are interested in that, and if you're writing a newspaper or a book, it's a lot less interesting to write stuff about how, crops are doing pretty well and humans are doing pretty well overall, and we're not all going to die. That's just not as exciting as we are all going to die. I think that's part of it in the media. I don't know. I think Andy Revkin talks about the headline, that you have to have a real catchy headline to get on the front page of the New York Times. You had to have something really catchy about climate. And if you did a study and your conclusion was that there's really nothing wrong, everything's pretty much fine, there's no way that that's going to get on the front page of the New York Times. But if you write something saying, looks like we're all going to die by 2050, got to do something, then it's much more likely you get attention. So big problems and the end of the world gets attention. Reality doesn't get as much attention.
It is weird how media does hit one of these climate change topics when they're going through their trending of doom articles. Like in the beginning, it was a lot about vaccines and it was a lot about COVID. And then next it was about like a missing influencer or about riots or about some type of racial indiscrimination. And the next thing you know, it was climate change, where you saw in the first two, they didn't work as well. Like people didn't really like quickly jump and lose their shit. But then it started hitting the climate change, and then it went from the climate change to a whole nother topic. And it went to Ukraine and Russia. And even though long before the media was reporting multiple issues and criticizing Ukraine for being like a horrible country and all these things, and they immediately switched their opinion. Where you get to this aspect of like, I get the purpose of selling articles or selling views on the basis of fear. And I think the environment's something that we all care about. We all don't want to die and all this. But then you look to who's the figures that you trust. When you look at politicians that are taking airplanes and caught like being environmentalists or something like that, saying we need to do something about climate change, yet they're taking billion-dollar jets somewhere. And then they also have talking about 2100 ocean levels are going to rise by 6 feet. We're all going to be underwater. Then they have beachfront property.
Yes. Yeah.
It's like, obviously it's not that big of a concern if you're still living where you live. I should see you like in the middle of Montana somewhere.
Yeah, I think people have way less trust, it seems like, in experts now than they did 2 years ago. I know I personally have less trust as I've seen all of these things playing out over the last 2 years. And I'm hearing people say, if they're lying to us about this, then what else have they been lying to us about? So I think the general lies we've heard about a lot of things over the last couple of years have kind of reflected poorly on climate science. It just seems like, as I talk to people in my daily life, it seems like people are questioning whatever they're being told more now. I don't know if you're seeing that yourself, but my blind faith in almost anybody has been shot. And I feel like I have to almost always do some sanity checking on my own just to see if what I'm being told has any resemblance to reality or not.
I wouldn't say that people are waking up. I would say that people, like, if you look at like since like 1963 when Kennedy was killed, you can see a drop off in percentages of just the number of faith that people have in their kind of government, mostly because in that specific incident, that assassination thing, a lot of the people that were alive around that, there's around 80% of people that believe that there was a conspiracy involved in it. Now, there's a very important distinction when you say the word conspiracy, or people say, like, climate, whatever, is conspiracy. You need to decipher the difference between conspiracy, which is legal language. They say conspiracy to commit violence, conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit a crime. That is legal lingo that you can use. What they're talking about is fantasy, which is this idea that there's like Illuminati, a secret cabal, and all these types of things. All the really crazy stuff that gets labeled conspiracy, that's a fantasy. That's not conspiracy. Conspiracy is just a plot to do something, is a plot or a direction of things. And it can be an exposure of things as well too. I think it's a very important distinction to make, because then you get into situations where we have now where people are like, how could the government do this? They're very quick to jump and blame a certain side, rather than looking at, it's not about sides in this matter. It's about that there's an issue with an over encroachment onto your rights as a human being. And I think everyone can agree with that. But there's base conclusions that you can make when it comes to, like, for me, I definitely think humans have an impact on their environment. We've always had an impact on our environment. But do I think it's being distorted irrationally? Yes. Do I know why? I don't. And I'm very, very curious why. I think it's because it's something that we all experience. We all experience hot days. We all experience cold days. There's gaps and all this type of stuff. But I think when it comes to the fear of like the earth dying tomorrow, that is something that gets people to react. But then you start to fall off when the same people that pitch that narrative talk about just stop having kids and you'll fix it. Like, then it's like, what the fuck are we talking about? And I think there's a logical discussion to be had if we look at a basis of what are our next step forward. And I think that is the idea of renewable energies. But I also think that if you shun fossil fuels now, you're going to have a lot of productions and a lot of businesses that haven't been able to change over yet that are going to suffer. And then you have a country like in Africa, for instance. Are we going to regulate them, tell them they can't use fossil fuels? They do this energy initiative and they ban nuclear, or they just made nuclear part of the energy initiative. Well, you told Germany that don't use nuclear energy. It's not going to be part of this green energy initiative. And then you lied and you switched it. Whether that was you changed your mind, whatever, but they just spent so much money shutting down every single one of their last plants. And now they're hindered in growth as a society. So you got to realize that the implications don't just affect you, they affect everybody. And that's for both sides. That's the climate skeptics, and that's the people that parrot the narrative of that climate change. You guys have to understand that whether I get it, if you can be brainwashed to think that your side is 100% right and the other side's not. And I'm not saying you're not. I'm trying to speak middle ground here. There are people out there listening, or people out there that are curious, that just want to hear the truth on things. And if you both are speaking your essential truth, it becomes an issue, because then now you have people that just want to give up on the topic in general. Then you have nothing going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know what the answer is there. As you're talking, at some point, I was thinking of there is so much of an incentive to sell products using the climate scam. I think that's a big part of it. That if you want to be a good person, if you put solar panels on the roof of your house, you're not just doing it to gain energy and run the appliances in your house. You're doing it because you're saving the planet. You're a good person, and you're saving lives in the future. I think there's a lot of that. You buy an electric car, it's not just a cool car to drive around in. You're actually preventing the deaths of children in the future. It makes you feel better about yourself. So I think in many ways, the virtue signaling or just feeling better about yourself is a big motivator. That this whole idea of a looming catastrophe means that if you skip eating a cheeseburger, then you're helping save human civilization. It's just so attractive to think you're doing something to save humans in the future. And it's just kind of a bummer, I think, for people like that to figure out that there really isn't a problem. If you skip your cheeseburger, you just didn't eat the cheeseburger, but it's not like you saved anybody's life. And you maybe you need to find some other thing to give your life meaning. I think a lot of the climate activists that are super into it are really searching for something to give their life meaning. Something I would think.
Well,
yeah.
you also get a tax cut when you put solar panels. They've incentivized people to get like a tax break. You just got to write it down and make sure you get like $1,000 or something like that.
Yeah, Warren Buffett just said that his company is one of the biggest investors in wind turbines. They put up enormous amounts of wind turbines in Iowa, and he said that they don't make sense without the subsidy. So that's a huge deal that he's putting all that money in, and what we're doing is subsidizing Warren Buffett. It's pretty odd that low-income taxpayers might be subsidizing one of the richest guys in the world just to do something that he wouldn't do unless he had that subsidy. I think that is kind of a travesty.
I do want to distinguish something for the article that I just came across. Um, the show is conversation. It's not interviews. It's conversation. So if I talk too much, I'm sorry. Uh, but also when it comes to the amount of environmentalists I've spoken to, like I'm not just speaking to one side. I've talked to a lot of people. I've done a lot of these things, and they've never ever brought up the idea of climate change. I've even suggested methods of trying to talk about, hey, like what's a good way to like save the environment? It's like the only thing I've ever really heard of is like affecting migration patterns, but it would take a long, long period of time to really affect it that much. But the random shifts in climate, they never blame fossil fuels. They never blame human interaction. If anything, they blame noise pollution. That's one thing that they will talk about is noise pollution. The amount of human like noise that goes on, it does distort some of those animals like patterns of like how they, I guess, develop or how they form, do whatever they do on a daily basis. Which is the only thing I've really ever seen a point raised by it. But when I dig into the question of like what's good ideas to talk about, they know a little bit, but they're like, it's not as big as a concern as someone who's not even an environmentalist would get interested in. Like it's like the general public seems to have like a really crappily done educated job on the concept of it. And I think it's because they're not exposed to just both sides. They're exposed to one side or the other.
Yeah, I don't know if many people in the general public even know that it's supposed to be carbon dioxide that causes global warming. I mean, as I talk to random people, it doesn't seem like they've even gone that far into it. I think some people are
Monoxide
thinking
comes
maybe
from your stove.
monoxide. Yeah,
Yeah.
yep. But yeah, I think some people are still making jokes about maybe it's hairspray that's causing the global warming. That was a thing back in the day. It was probably older people. Hairspray was supposed to cause problems with the ozone layer back in the day. Maybe they're thinking hairspray. I don't know if people even use hairspray anymore, but maybe that's causing global warming. But bottom line is people have not thought very deeply about this at all. Most people, I would say. You did mention animals migrating around. I thought it was interesting that Mark Morano has been talking about the armadillo is supposed to be moving north. I don't know why that's bad, but if the U.S. warms up a little bit, the armadillo loves warmth and it's able to live in further north if it's warmer further north. But that animal was used also in the 1970s because it was moving south to escape the cold. So the armadillos are moving north and south depending on how warm the U.S. is getting. But that's just the way it goes. I think the temperatures are fluctuating, and when it gets cold again, they'll move back south again. But it's not going to cause them to go extinct, and they're just moving around.
If mankind's affecting their environment that much, then how can we not have mastered hydropower yet? Like all I ever hear is if you try and put a turbine underwater to be able to harness that power, it's the ocean is so uncontrollable that it's hard to manage. Where I just go, how do you expect you can't manage the ocean? How the hell can you manage the whole entire Earth?
Yeah, are you talking about? There's hydropower just of rivers too, right? I think if you're really concerned about green energy, I think hydropower of rivers is a great way to go. I think there's some huge electricity generation going on in China through some of the biggest hydropower plants are over there, I think. My dad has often said that it doesn't release basically any carbon dioxide. It takes cement and stuff to build a dam. But if you're really concerned about green power, you probably shouldn't be fighting hydropower. And I've seen a lot of environmentalists fighting hard against hydropower at Berkshire Hathaway meetings, because I guess they generate a bunch of electricity using that. But if you're really believing in the CO2 crisis, hydropower and nuclear power. There's a guy named Michael Schellenberger who's very heavily involved in promoting nuclear powers. If you really do believe CO2 is going to kill us all, you can't be opposing nuclear power, because that's a great way to produce tons of reliable energy without without releasing CO2 in the process.
The people that dismiss hydropower, what are they parroting?
Why are they against it? Or
like what are they supporting as the best source then?
Oh, it seems like people just want to gravitate towards wind and solar. And I think they would just do that now until people actually do produce a lot of power using wind and solar. And then I think they'll fight back. I think they're going to fight whatever we're using. And already some environmentalists are pushing back against wind and solar, I guess. If you're cutting down trees to put up those, it's probably not a good idea to cut down trees to put up solar panels.
Solar power would work if you were able to get some type of craft, like a spacecraft that had solar panels on it, to be able to conduct and have like a constant feed of solar power without worrying about clouds and stuff. But that's the issue, is that weather's unpredictable in some sense. So you get to, I mean, that's why my weatherman is always wrong all the time. But you get into this aspect of like, if you make a whole field of solar panels that might be able to power a very small percent, maybe a couple of homes or a street or so, then what happens if it's cloudy? Then all those solar panels are to waste. I mean, they built a whole entire field of wind turbines, and there was any wind to power it. So you had a bunch of turbines just standing up in the middle of a field with no use at all to it.
Mm-hmm. I was just talking to a guy that lives not far from where I am right now. He's a farmer, and he has one of the most beautiful forests in this area. He just got an offer from a solar company to cut down that forest to put up solar panels. And that's in Minnesota. So that's replacing a beautiful forest. And I think it makes very little sense in general this far north to have solar panels, because for much of the year, the angle of the sun is pretty low. It's not warm, it doesn't warm up enough here to melt the snow. So I think a good portion of the time, those solar panels are going to be sitting there producing hardly any power, maybe even covered by snow. So the whole idea of paying big bucks to do that, to prevent Minnesota from getting too hot, it's just a total farce. It doesn't make any sense. I think in some areas, solar panels make sense, but to have the government doing crazy things with taxpayer dollars to try to prevent bad weather and to end up cutting down forests to do it, it's a lot of bad things rolled into one.
Now, I did talk to someone who studies with nanotechnology, who talked about ways of being able to get nanoscience, obviously this is a hypothetical, to get to a point where they're able to actually help out in the ozone layer, some parts of pollution issues that people do recognize as being issues that need to be fixed. Instead of using trees, using carbon capture, there's a way to use nanotechnology to, you're kind of like, when you see, oh God, what's it called? When jet streams, when they have that thing, what do they call those streams that
contrail? No, contrail? No,
I think that's what it is. It's like what conspiracy people say when they're like, oh, they're spraying. Yeah. So they have a way of using a device that could be able to release nanotechnology, really small particles, to be able to like swarms, basically little robotic swarms. And they have a way to be able to absorb some of these little carbon particles. You ever hear about that?
I have not heard about that.
Okay.
That they're going to get rid of carbon dioxide that way?
Well, what I'm saying is I've talked to a lot of futurists who also think they worry a lot about not only the human species, but they also worry about the environment and the planet as well, too. And a lot of their topics of discussion, they think of like implementing technology into their body. And speaking with someone who studies nanoscience, they talked about these ideas of a nano shield. And if you look up nano shield, they do talk about like this protective layer. It's supposed to be used for planetary defense, but has other aspects to it when it comes to the aspect of like global warming, being able to reduce a lot of the issues with global warming as well, too.
Interesting. That makes me think of, there was a guy that was in the news that was going to genetically modify humans in order to prevent global warming. I think he was going to modify us so that we're a lot smaller, because smaller people have a smaller carbon footprint. I think that was part of it. And I think there might have been part of a deal where he was going to modify us so we didn't like the taste of meat. That might have been part of it, because meat causes bad weather. So if we had humans, a new race of humans that didn't like to eat meat, that would prevent bad weather. I forget what else, but it seemed incredibly crazy to me.
Sounds like the similar thing of genetically modifying cows to fart less.
Yeah, it might have been the same guy. Who knows? Yeah.
What graphs did you have that you said you wanted to pull up?
Well, I do have a few here. I can share the screen. Do you want to take a look here? I got like 10 things here.
I'm interested in it.
Okay, let's see here.
I'm more interested where you got that backdrop.
Oh, my wife got it somewhere. I don't know. I have to ask her. Let's see. I got a bunch of ClimateGate emails. Maybe we don't want to take the time to go through those. There's all sorts of stuff here about them adjusting the data and manipulating the data,
So who's
arguing with
Michael
each other,
Mann? Who's
etc.
Michael Mann?
He's the number one guy behind the hockey stick. He's the major author of the hockey stick that shows allegedly that Earth's temperature basically was flat until we started burning fossil fuel, and then the temperature shot up. That's supposed to be what happened over the last 1,000 years or 1,500 years. So I don't know if you've heard much about that graph, but it's kind of a centerpiece of the whole global warming scam, that temperatures are supposed to be flat and humans are the reason that it went up. So he deleted the medieval warm period and other fluctuations. The bogus graph.
Yeah, I've heard of the medieval warm period before, but this is Phil Jones with the earlier FOI request. David Holland wasted a part of a day deleting numerous emails and exchanges with almost all the skeptics.
Yeah, so there was a bunch of freedom of information requests that came in to find out what was really going on behind the scenes. And he admits here in his email that he was deleting those emails, which you're not supposed to do. The whole freedom of information thing is you're supposed to share your emails because it was taxpayer funded research, and we need to find out what they were doing. But anyway, he's admitting that he was going in there and deleting those emails. And this whole ClimateGate thing, somehow either someone hacked in there or some insider ended up releasing hundreds of thousands of emails that were supposed to be, I think, part of a freedom of information request, but they got released in a different way. So that's where these emails are coming from here.
Do you know who Randall Carlson is?
I've heard that name, but I don't know any details. No.
You got to listen to his episode on Joe Rogan. He is a younger dryas person who believes in the impact hypothesis, and he does mention that the Earth goes through these fluctuations of change, and a lot of the change of the Earth isn't due to humans, but it also necessarily doesn't open up the door for us to be able to abuse the shit out of our environment as well either.
So one thing I wanted to mention on top there, it's Michael Mann admitting that we certainly don't know the global mean temperature anomaly very well, which is a very key thing because that's what they're using. You mentioned that they're telling us each year the temperature is going up. That's the number they're talking about. And he's admitting here they don't know what that number is. The whole idea of trying to figure out exactly how warm the Earth is at any given time, it's incredibly hard because there's mountains and there's all sorts of stuff going on. There's urban heat islands. And he's admitting internally that we don't really know that anomaly. But externally, they're saying, hey, this was the warmest year ever by maybe 0.02 C, which they're just pretty much making that up for propaganda purposes. They don't know the temperature of the Earth to within 2/100ths of a degree centigrade, but according to the propaganda, they do know.
Yeah, I had a guy on recently talking about he studies the Earth's core. And he talked about like they don't know what makes this magnetic field, and is it possible that this magnetic field that's around our Earth is how the origin of life started? I mean, there's a lot that we don't know about the planet that we're on. That's pretty surprising.
Yeah, tons of stuff. There's all sorts of, I believe, underwater volcanoes that may not have ever been discovered yet. I don't think we know exactly what's going on with them.
And the idea of people talk about this, and I had a guest explain the other side of this, and the guest explained why we should use this. The idea of using ancient microbes, this China in the bottom of the ocean floor, this layer that's there, that is from the Jurassic period. That's like from the dinosaurs. It's fossil fuel type stuff. It's like dinosaur, like it's an outer layer, like a crust.
Okay.
That goes away, but it takes millions of years to build up. So that's like a very temporary solution. We would run through all that in a matter of like 20, 30 years. So I think people use that, like I've heard of using like hydropower and using this type of power. I just wanted to clarify that up because once that's gone, it's gone. And we don't know the impact of how that would affect our oceans at all.
Okay, very interesting. Very interesting. All right, so I've got 3 pages of this. I don't know if we have time to go through this.
Dude, you got a full other hour left.
Okay. Yeah, the third one down. I think it's interesting admission from Trendbirth. We are nowhere close to knowing where the energy is going or whether clouds are changing to make the planet brighter. So that's a huge admission right there that they don't know. They don't know what's happening with the clouds or where the energy is going. So that's a constant theme within these ClimateGate emails where externally they're saying, hey, the science is settled, and maybe it's basic physics. We understand everything. Internally, they're saying, we don't know. We don't know what's going on. And they don't. So it's incredibly important that outsiders know that nobody really understands this. The whole idea that we're going to make huge changes to how we're powering our economy in order to fix something that we don't really understand is not the way to go.
Isn't the reason a part of the reason why they don't know is because of the data is so fluctuating and it's very, very hard to predict the course or direction of where it's going?
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's a lot of stuff in here about they have the raw data that comes from the temperature stations, et cetera, and it's being adjusted a lot. One of them in here someplace talks about adjusting the same set of data 3 different times. There was an adjustment a while back, and then they homogenized it again, and then they did some other changes, and they haven't kept records of how the data has been changed. And somewhere in here, they admit that they can't find the raw data. They can't even find the original data. So the data they have in some critical places is data that once was raw data, and we don't even know if that was good. And then it's been adjusted up to 3 other times, and we don't have the records of what happened. So the data is not something that we should be basing our economy on. It's got lots of problems anyway.
Well, it's about as sensitive as our supply chain. It's always fluctuating.
Yeah. Another one here is that in 2007, they were trying to figure out what to do about a critical 1990 IPCC graph that looks nothing like the hockey stick. So the IPCC is supposed to be the Bible, and whatever they say is the truth. And there was a graph in 1990 that's supposed to be the truth that shows the medieval warm period is much warmer than the current period. And then in 2007, they were thinking, what are we going to do about that? Because what we told you was the truth in 1990 doesn't look at all what we're telling you the truth is now. So there's a big problems with conflicts about what the data is supposed to look like in the past. You can't just tell us that the past changed 1,000 years after this fact. There has to be a right answer, and you can't just keep changing it. That's part of that one.
Well, the only way you can get accurate data is if you were back then being able to actually use the technology we have now to be able to determine that. So
absolutely. Yeah. Yep. Then the next one down, there was a letter circulating over there at the university protesting warm weather sold as good news. And the quote was, "The newspapers are similarly awash with bikinis, cheering holiday makers, and news of record grape harvests," end quote. So they're bummed that the actual the paper is saying that people like warm weather, and everybody's kind of happy about it being warm. And as an aside here, the local weather guy here in Minnesota, we just had a day which with a high temperature of 80, and he was saying it's a perfect day that is 80 degrees here, which I think is a very interesting admission because Minnesotans do like warm weather. Average temperature here where I am right now annually is 45 degrees. So he's saying a temperature that's 80 degrees is perfect. We're supposed to worry about it's going to warm up in a degree or two. But anyway, bottom line is humans obviously like warm weather more than they like cold weather. And the coverage of reality where people like to vacation in warm areas, et cetera, the people inside of the climate gate people or the climate scientists didn't like that positive coverage of warm weather.
When it's cold, what do you like to do?
I mostly like to stay inside when it's cold. I don't do too much outside when it's cold.
And when it's warm, what do you like to do? Go outside?
Yeah, then all sorts of stuff. I ride my bike hours on end, and I'm outside way more. And I often tell people that out here in my yard, it's warm enough to sit outside comfortably for an hour in shorts and a t-shirt. It's a tiny percentage of the time compared to the entire year. Most of the year, if you try that, you'll get cold and have to go inside. It's generally too cold to sit outside rather than too warm.
I definitely think that a lot of this narrative of like the dangers of the climate warming is because I think these people also probably parrot the same point, is that there's too many people on Earth. Only because you know why they call it wet, hot American summer. When it's warm, you want to repopulate, man. You're hot and sweaty. You want to get hot and sweaty. That's the whole point of the thing.
Yeah. Tons of Minnesotans look forward to all winter long. They get 1 week to go fly down south and spend some time in a nice warm weather someplace. That's
get drunk on the lake.
Very popular thing to do. Yeah. Next thing down, how the consensus is built. They were talking about 4 people could get together and fly to Switzerland from the US and then have a, quote, honest discussion over a few beers to sort out the real issues of climate, quote, of which there are many. So they're admitting that there's many issues. They certainly wouldn't admit that to the public, but internally they're admitting there's many issues. But I thought it was interesting that just 4 of them are going to get together and then they're going to figure out what the consensus is, just whatever 4 people say. And I think they should be listening to a lot more than 4 people if they're going to come up with some story about what everybody inside believes. Anyway, let's see. Another one down here, Tom Wigley, I think he's passed away. He was talking about paleo reconstructions or using data from tree rings, et cetera, to try to figure out what was going on. He said, quote, "The differences between them prior to 1850 make me very nervous. If I were on the greenhouse denier side, I would be inclined to focus on the wide range of paleo results. and the differences between them as an argument for dismissing them all, end quote. So he's admitting there that there's all sorts of people doing these reconstructions, and the reconstructions vary widely. So they can't all be right. There's all sorts of differences. And it just points out that they are kind of guessing when they're trying to use all these reconstructions to figure out what the temperature was in the year 1200. It's not like they had a whole network of satellites like we do now. So there's a lot of room for guessing in the paleo reconstructions.
Where are they getting their paleo reconstructions at, though? Like, what devices are measuring the results that are being pulled from that? Wouldn't that just depend on the location that you're in? Like
yeah, yep.
I'll say the same issues you have like in East Coast or something when it comes to a paleo reconstruction compared to somewhere if you had on West Coast. They're going to be completely different variables based on the landscape.
Yep. That is a very good question, because there was the tree rings used in the hockey stick. They took cores from trees in the west coast of the US quite a bit. I think there was some bristlecone pines that were very long lived. They would take a core sample and they basically look at the tree rings and try to guess what the temperature was in the year 1200 based on the width of the tree rings, et cetera. And we're supposed to believe that trees can function as a thermometer, but they very carefully select which trees give them the right answer. And they carefully weighted some trees way more because they wanted the answer given by those trees. So there's all sorts of leeway to produce any temperature reconstruction that you want based on which trees you pick and how you work on the data. So the whole idea that we should trust those reconstructions, even though they conflict with each other, is ridiculous. And then you can't really use tree rings, I guess, to try to figure out temperatures around the tropics, because there aren't really tree rings in trees, I believe, on the equator. So it's there's a lot of farcical stuff going on here. I don't know if I answered the question. Or
You did.
Yeah. Okay.
I was looking at the Ed Cook thing. I'm trying to figure out who Ed Cook is. I've heard the name before.
Ed Cook was also a tree ring guy, I think, in Arizona. He said, quote, "I do find the dismissal of the medieval warm period as a meaningful global event to be grossly premature and probably wrong," end quote. So that is in itself is a major admission right there internally, because one of the big points of the hockey stick is that the medieval warm period didn't occur and temperatures were pretty much flat until around 1850 when they started shooting through the roof, or they started going much higher there. Because the medieval warm period is very inconvenient. It wasn't that long ago in geological terms, so maybe 1,000 years ago. And it definitely happened. In 1990, the IPC said it happened. But in like 1999 or so, then suddenly the consensus became that it didn't happen. And that wasn't really a consensus. I think it was mostly Michael Mann and a few insiders decided that the medieval warm period was inconvenient. So they wanted to erase it because it makes their story look better. And there's a hard problem of explaining why the medieval warm period happened if you admit that it did happen.
Do you have all this actual email evidence, or is this all just quotes? Okay, so this is linked on your site?
Yes, I just, these are kind of highlights, but it is linked from my notes for climate skeptics. All of them, you can click on them. You can see the entire email and when exactly it was sent, et cetera. It's all on my site. Yeah, these are just highlights.
I'm just making sure.
Okay, let's see. Okay, Warmest Mike Holm. This is a good quote. Quote, "Sexing up evidence is so easy to do, isn't it?" End quote. And I think there's a lot of sexing up of evidence. There all sorts of things were done to try to make the story look more alarming and more exciting. The real story is a lot less exciting.
You're telling me a giant bold red title doesn't alarm some people?
I guess not. Okay, so Phil Jones, he said that the nonprofit EGU, they asked Al Gore to speak about saving human civilization from our CO2-induced collapse. But then Gore asked them for $50,000 in cash, which I just think was an interesting admission, that if Gore is really trying to save the planet, you think he might even just do it for free instead of asking for a sack of money with $50,000 in it. So yeah, Gore made plenty of money giving us talks back then. I think that was maybe the heyday of when Al Gore was more of a rock star in terms of the climate crisis. I think he's maybe not, people aren't as excited about paying him money now to talk about it. Not sure. Okay, next one down, Phil Jones in 2007, he quote said, he talked about research malpractice allegations against some climate people in the US and Europe, end quote. And the next quote, "I reckon only a few in the climate field know the full extent of what is going on behind the scenes in climate science," end quote. So again, there's an admission that there's all this stuff going on behind the scenes. They're fighting with each other, and they're adjusting the data. And what we're seeing from the outside is not what's happening in the inside.
Well, I mean, even if you look at Andrew Dressler, who talked about like he wanted to debate the science behind it, but the climate science isn't settled. Climatologists have different views from atmospheric scientists, and atmospheric scientists have different views than renewable energy people. So it's like there's a big discussion that needs to be had, an overall conference with more than 4 people that should be occurring.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which is weird that we have all these billionaires that are the ones that are like the faces of these giant environmental movements, where it just makes me question, like, is there actually anybody who's actually looking at the data and trying to talk about the data, not just parrot their points?
Yeah, I think Dessler, I don't know if you heard his debate he had with Alex Epstein, but mostly Dessler wanted to talk about just energy generation and stuff. He definitely wanted to just say, hey, we've already won the climate argument. Let's not get it down in the weeds of medieval warm period, et cetera. Let's talk about the solutions because we've already won the climate debate. But that's absolutely not true. They did not win the debate. I think it's important to focus on this stuff about really, did we even change the climate before we talk about what we should do to stop changing the climate. Next thing, I'll go on here. I'm going to group these together. There's just a lot of emails talking about how the incredible amount of fossil fuel travel the climate scientists were doing. They were quickly going to Tahiti and Turkey and Tuscany, and they're going to Hawaii, Italy. They're just flying all over the place in an embarrassing amount of flying. And if they actually believe that they're trying to convince the general public not to fly. It's just ironic that they were just flying so much. You think if they really believed, they would be able to act as if they believed it. They were not. Yeah. Let's see. Okay, here's phrases about data inside what I call the IPCC sausage factory. Quote, fairly large differences throughout. Looks kind of scary. I'm advocating adopting an ostrich position. I'm taking the path of least resistance. I'll just ignore any error messages and keep running it with a max. We know it to be suboptimal. So there's just all this whole idea of just kind of overlooking error messages, and no one's really going to check, and let's just not worry about it too much. There's not a lot of scientific scrutiny and making sure that they're getting everything right. It's more important to have a good story than to get everything right, I would say.
Well, when you don't agree with something, instead of it turning into a long, giant tirade where you're just getting hate messages all the time, maybe it should be something where people are just having an actual discussion. Like we keep mentioning before, I mean, this is a really big issue. I don't think realize, like, it gets to the point where in Canada, they had a lady who died at 70 years old, and a part of her autopsy or cause of death was climate change.
I see.
Now,
Yeah.
so you get to this point, like she had diabetes, she was stuck on a hot day inside of her car. You can't just say, and possibly climate change. That's something that will eventually over time leak into a point of that becoming an actual thing people start talking about, saying, oh, they died of climate change. Is it that, or did they have a lot of other conditions that were going on, like being in a fucking hot car?
Yeah, I think I mentioned before that there was an actual Lancet article that said that cold weather kills 20 times as many people as hot weather.
I told you, warm periods are periods of growth, not cold.
Well, yeah. So you could say that if someone dies of hypothermia, that one of the causes of death is that the Earth is too cold, and if the Earth was warmer, then maybe they wouldn't have died. But of course, that doesn't make sense either. Next down here, we have Revkin, who is a New York Times writer. I think it's interesting he admitted it. He said, it's true that by comparison with the glacial world, the interglacial climate, like right now, has been less angry. My sense is that Wally Broker's notion that the angry beast is a creature of colder areas, but not of warmer times, has some support. So that's basically Revkin admitting that warmer periods have been better than cold periods. Weather's been more angry, weather's been worse for humans when it's been cold. The weather is generally better when it's warm. Next one down, someone insider said the only thing that counts is numbers. The media is going to say 1,000 scientists signed or 1,500 signed. No one is going to check if it is 600 with PhDs versus 2,000 people without PhDs. So I think it's interesting that no one is going to check. That let's just say something that sounds influential and not worry about people checking it out.
It's called large words.
Yeah. Another thing, internal email, stupid and politicized action and silly oversellings by the IPCC. And then a Met Office guy admits, quote, the paleo community cannot do stats, end quote. And also very interesting, I think a lot of insiders who are doing this important statistical work on paleoclimate we're not statistical experts. And I think it's clear that Steve McIntyre, who's debunking their stuff, knew more about actual statistics than they did. So it's an important admission. Let's see. I'm going to skip the next one. This last one, though, Richard Somerville, a quote, "We don't understand cloud feedbacks. We don't understand air-sea interactions. We don't understand aerosol indirect effects. The list is long," end quote. So just that one excerpt from all the ClimateGate emails, that's huge. That there's a long list of things that they don't understand. And again, from the outside, we're supposed to think that they understand everything. They know what's going to happen next. If we stop eating cheeseburgers, they can predict what's going to happen. Anyway, they don't understand Earth's climate. That's the major message.
I've talked to a list of people that talk about aerosol contaminants and the amount that it's causing with birth defects when it comes to not just hairsprays, but types of metals and other types of things that are involved in our everyday products. Cleaning products, for instance, nobody really thought about during this pandemic when we were wiping down surfaces.
Yeah.
Restaurants, people at home were wiping down every single thing that they touched. And that smell of bleach, I mean, obviously you're inhaling that. It's not good for you. I mean, these are all things that we're looking at now and realizing they played a big health effect, especially there's a large amount of percentage of the population, from what I've heard from Joseph Braun, talking about the number of people being born today that have some type of mental disorder, not necessarily in the sense of like, it's mostly cognition issues, but in the sense of like ADHD, some types of these types of things where maybe they're diagnosing it more. That's an area that we can look at, but also to think that it's not from all the contaminants that, we all know that there's phthalates in our blood right now from our use of plastic consumption. So you got to leak into what else there's their thing. Is it gas fumes? You never really want a pregnant woman pumping their own gas or breathing that type of thing in. There is a fear that it could harm the baby. It's the same thing as drinking alcohol or smoking a cigarette. There's these damages that play into effect. I think there's a lot of multifactorial stuff when it comes to maybe what people are speaking about with human change or environmental change. I think they really need to examine the aspect of what we're doing to ourselves, because we're destroying ourselves, not in the way of climate. We're destroying ourselves in the way that we just grow as people.
I just did hear from some doctor that it might not be a good idea to use too much hand sanitizer and kill off everything that's living on your hands, because some of that biome on your hands even might be something that it's better to have it there than not. Not sure.
Well, people's immune systems are getting weaker because they're not being exposed to as much contaminants, which makes a really big question for this pandemic. From the number of scientists I've talked to about the pandemic, they do talk about this area of comfortability that we live in our lives today, the ease of access to food, the ease of access to medicine, the ease of access to all these things, where makes our bodies a little bit weaker when we use a pill or something to be able to overcome a lot of these illnesses. That doesn't destroy medicine, it doesn't tear it down, but also you got to keep aware with every add-on that you have and every luxury, in a sense, of what having access to food as we do, there is a downside to it. And that is the fact that your body will be more susceptible to diseases and viruses.
I completely agree with that. Yeah. All right, I'll move on to the next one here. This one I liked a lot. Sarah Raper on magical climate models. Quote, "You can make the 20th century glacier melt bigger or smaller by moving the ELA 1961 to 1990 up and down," end quote. So this was written in 2004. So I think it's just very interesting that you can do something in 2004, you can just move something up and down and you can change glacier melt that happened last century. That's, I don't understand how that can work. You're just modeling stuff, you're playing around with data, but obviously you can't change what actually happened. You're just changing what's happening in your models. So I think there's a lot of people who are working so hard on models that they're starting, the lines between reality and what's happening in their models is blurring, that they get lost in the models and don't take enough time to sanity check that against the real world. Yeah. Let's see. The next one is just about Phil Jones that says he's putting a paper together. It's been a real nightmare because he can't get any response from Keith, Tim, or Casper. And I know two of them are in rooms less than 5 meters away from me. So I don't know what was going on there, but they weren't necessarily agreeing or working together as a team that time. Let's see. Phil Jones in 2007 on James Hansen's magic red global warming hoax crayon. Quote, "Their extrapolation also makes Antarctica much warmer than it probably was," end quote. So again, there's all these, there's a lot of modeling going on and guessing about what temperatures really were. And here's Phil Jones admitting that the guesses made Antarctica look much warmer than it was. So from the outside, you might think that everything was measured and we know exactly all the data, but from the inside, you can see, again, a lot of guessing and modeling.
Well, it's manipulational. it's a manipulation of data. But the issue is that when you set something in stone, that's a foundational point like that is, then anybody that's looking at data from back then is going to come across that. Then all their data is going to be warped as well too.
Yeah.
Don't
Next one,
walk
John.
through every single one of these. Holy crap! Pick the good stuff out.
Okay. All right. Let's see.
I didn't want to cut you off, but I was like, holy crap! I was like,
Yeah,
this is a lot of
there's a lot.
reading.
Yeah. I like the one from Gavin Schmidt about putting up the data in quote in as impenetrable as possible form, end quote. So there's supposed to be we're all open here and let's share the data and let's let people take a look, and because we're confident in our data. So I think it was very interesting that internally he was saying, let's put it up in as impenetrable as possible. Clearly, they didn't want people checking on their data. And that's a theme throughout that. Phil Jones is very irked that Steve McIntyre keeps asking for data, because these papers are constantly getting rubber stamped without anybody actually looking at the data. So Phil Jones and other people were just irked that other people wanted to check to see if they were doing the right thing. Let's see. What else do we have here?
I like that one right there. It says climate realist Krista Free. I can't say his last name. North American geologist. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Krista Freitas, climate realist, said, North American geologists repeatedly assert that the 19th century was the coldest century in North America since the last glacial maximum. To that extent, showing temperature increase since then is not unlike a mutual fund salesman showing expected rate of return from a market bottom. It's not precisely false, but rather in the realm of sleight of hand, end quote. And that is a great quote, that you can show any trend you want if you very carefully pick the starting point that makes the trend look the way you want it to look. So I think I mentioned this before, that 19th century was very cold. And if you got to start everything, start all your graphs in the 19th century so that you get a nice warming trend that you want. If you go back further, if you start your graph in the peak of the medieval warm period, then you might see cooling between then and now. So I think it's a good way to express it, that if you're trying to sell mutual funds, if you can start calculating your yield right at a stock market bottom, and it looks like your mutual fund did fantastic, because look how far it is off the bottom. Yes,
I've learned to kind of not really trust anybody's graph data, whether it's your side or the other side, just because I think it's very easy to manipulate it, especially when you got a graph of stuff as well too. If you can just switch the numbers on the side or switch things and make the increments maybe smaller or bigger, you can really make that graph look a certain way.
absolutely. I totally agree. Okay, I'll just do the last one here. Phil Jones, for the 1940 to 1960 period, quote, if the sea surface temperatures were adjusted, they would look much better, end quote. So there's a lot of that all through these emails, talking about how the data we have doesn't really look that good. It doesn't sell the story we want, but if we adjust it, then it'll look better and help us sell our story. There's just tons of that. So that's the end of ClimateGate for now, but there are hundreds and hundreds of these in my blog if you want to take a look. And it's a real eye opener that there's so many of these. Okay. Then I have a few more things here. I'm going to skip by that one. Here's the global fire one. I don't know if you've seen this one before, but it shows that since the 1900s, if you look at global fires, there's a general downward trend. So again, we're supposed to think the world's on fire now, but the world was way more on fire 100 years ago than it is now. That's my major point.
Well, it's also because the amount of exposure of fires are more, because it gets reported and there's more people with devices than there ever has been before.
Yes, yeah, that's a case of bad weather in general, that we're finding out about it way more now than we were in the past. Okay, and then there's a story that we're going to starve, that the crop yields are going to go down, and that it absolutely is 100% contradicted by the data, that yields are just going way up. You can see the list of all the different crops on the right, whether you're talking about bananas or wheat or maize or whatever, crop yields are going up. So there's a lot of different reasons why the crop yields are up. Part of the reason is that additional CO2 helps crops grow better. That's just part of the reason. But we have better seeds and better techniques and all sorts of better insecticides, all sorts of factors. But none of them are causing us to starve. So the idea of worrying about starving because of carbon dioxide is totally a non-starter. Here's another one, grain yields, about U.S. corn grain yields since 1866. I thought this one was kind of interesting, that it stayed flat for so long. And then just lately, since maybe 1970 or so, those corn yields have gone way up. So again, no signal of starvation in there.
Well, would that be the implementation of GMOs, not the implementation of the carbon?
Yeah, I don't actually know how to attribute to all those yields exactly what's causing it all, but definitely, definitely better seeds are making a difference. My dad is a corn farmer, and he's talked about how they're able to plant corn so much closer together now than they were back in the 1960s, that the individual plants are much closer together. And he was also saying that it might be a whole field where every single corn plant is genetically the same. It's like they're identical twins. Back in the day, there was a lot of variation in the corn. So you'd plant 100 seeds and you might get 100 different, slightly different corn plants. But now you might plant 100, and if everything else is the same, all 100 plants might look pretty much the same. But anyway, the seeds are definitely better. Yeah. Next one, I just wanted to make a point here is people are all worried that it's going to get too hot to grow corn. But it says here that for corn, the fastest growth rate is at 86 degrees Fahrenheit, 30 degrees centigrade. And corn continues to grow rapidly, even at 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 centigrade. And yeah, corn really likes hot weather. And it doesn't get that hot very often in Minnesota. Where I am now, not much further north of here, it gets harder and harder to grow corn because the growing season is too short, and corn wants more heat. So the whole idea, again, that the earth is very close to the point where we can't grow crops anymore because it's too hot. We're not close to that point at all. Yeah. Okay, that's just about it. Here's some of the things I like to say. I'm not going to go through these, but
I know the top one.
Yeah.
I've heard you say that a couple of times.
Yeah, I do like the third one down. Actual data is like kryptonite to climate cultists. So if you can get people talking about the actual data, not just what should be happening and what they think is going to happen in the future, but if you look at what actually has been happening, what is happening, they don't want to talk about that because the actual data, none of it is alarming. The actual data is very reassuring. But you can always make up a model that says that things are going to be terrible in 10 years. But if you look at what's happened, and we've been emitting CO2 for a long time, and nothing bad has been happening as a result of that.
Is there a reason why that they say that or a reason why that they think that maybe your data might be something that's being parroted from an old time? Because it seems like every article that I've read that kind of slant, like the one I read, for instance, the one that was about your episode on here, they pointed to an article of data that was mentioned that was, they said, in their opinion, debunked. That was like from like 97 or 98 or something like that. And do you think it's because that was when a data was actually good? It seems like the data might be manipulated now.
Yeah, that is, I think it's a good thing to seize on if they don't have anything else. That if the graph only goes up, I've seen this, if a graph only goes up to 2019 for crop yields or something, they go, oh, you must be hiding what's happened since 2019, that maybe everything's gone to hell since whatever the end period of the graph is. Then right after that, things must have gotten really bad. But I don't think there's much to that because, again, we've been emitting CO2 for a couple hundred years, maybe lots of it. So if we were going to see any sort of a signal of things getting bad, it should have happened even by 2018. It's not like things are fine for 200 years and then suddenly there's a sharp jump off into the bad times. So I'm not too worried about the end dates. And people do say this about the ClimateGate emails too, that the ClimateGate emails, we don't have any recent ones, so we don't know what the scientists were saying now, but we do have 200,000 emails about what they were saying when this critical graph, the hockey stick graph, was being created, et cetera. So we have all this critical stuff from then. And I would like to see what they're talking about right now, but we just don't have the ability to look at their current emails. So that's all I can say there. I'm pretty much done here, I think. At the end here, I've got a couple books, some really good books. I mentioned the one by Patrick Moore. The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change by Morano is fantastic. That's a good book even to start with if you really want to learn about the climate skeptic side. Alex Epstein has a couple books now, Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and I think Fossil Future is one that just came out. Got a couple good websites here. And at the bottom is how to look at some of my work if you want to. And that is it. So I can go ahead and stop sharing if you're ready.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, I think we covered a lot. It's almost been a 2-hour episode.
Yeah.
Do you think anything else you want to touch upon, or is that?
Let's see, what do I have here? Oh, I just wanted to thank you actually for having me on your podcast first, because after I did your podcast, then I got on to several other podcasts. A couple of Bitcoiners contacted me, Saifedean Ammous and Marty Bean. They contacted me to be on their podcast. And it's interesting that Bitcoin people in particular seem very interested in this because they're getting so much flack because people are pushing back against Bitcoin because Bitcoin mining uses electricity, and electricity allegedly causes bad weather. So there's a big pushback. Like, I think they might have outlawed Bitcoin mining in some places because of it causes bad weather, which is totally insane. So I wanted to thank you for that. And then Oh, a couple other things I've been kicking off on Twitter is I've done a couple Twitter lives where I just talk about this stuff on my own. And then just last week, I did my first Twitter space where people, it's kind of a new feature in Twitter. I don't know if you've used it much,
I've
where,
joined a couple of yours, but I didn't go all the way through with it because once I see the recording thing in the top, I was like, I don't want to be recorded.
yeah, yeah. So it's just an audio chat, but just anybody can join. If the host lets you speak, then you can just talk. It's all audio. It's pretty interesting. And you can record it and people can listen to it later. So I might do those on a regular basis, potentially, because I enjoy talking about this stuff.
Just
So
start a podcast.
I should. I don't know exactly all this technology that you got going here. I'm impressed. I'll have to ask you how you do this, how you publish on so many platforms all at once. Because
I can get you all the platforms to post on, but I wouldn't recommend posting like once a day like I do. That's fucking a lot.
no. What's the technological leap to go from not knowing what you're doing to being able to get stuff on Spotify and Apple and YouTube and everything like that, like you do? It's is it hard?
Anchor's probably the best platform just because Anchor lets you distribute to they distribute to 7 platforms for you. And then if you get another platform or something that you want to add on to it, you just add it onto their details and distribute it. So all I got, it's really easy, simple to post. But like when I mentioned like people go like your YouTube like videos, like I know the one article called out that you had 193 views on your YouTube. Nobody listens to fucking podcasts on YouTube. It doesn't happen. People want to do other stuff on their phones. They want to, go walk off and be able to play an app or something while they listen to you. So Spotify, I have over 2 million listens on that, but people see the YouTube and they see the subscribers number and they consider YouTube God. It's like YouTube's good for a 2-minute song or a 5-minute video. It's not good if you're trying to listen to a bunch of people have a conversation about stuff.
Yeah, I was telling you that before. I think that I listen to tons and tons of podcasts, but not through YouTube, through through Spotify or other, or always audio only because I'm doing something else. Yeah.
Because then if you're not charging your phone, you're wasting your battery going down like so much percentage when you can't close your phone because you have to have YouTube open the whole time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Another thing I wanted to mention is I've been talking to my friends about, I think you are becoming super informed by doing this all the time. You've done this way over 1,000 times, talking to a huge diverse group of people. I think it's super interesting that what you're doing. You must be learning a lot, like interviewing all sorts of people about JFK. You must have learned a ton about that.
Yeah.
Interviewing people both that believe in the conspiracy and don't. And yeah, so you're getting the perspectives from every side. I think it's fantastic.
I think that's what we should be doing more of. I think it takes time though. And I also think like, the one thing I noticed, I don't have any biases in anything. Like climate change can be real. Climate change could not be real. I don't have anything that I get super like where I stop on. One thing I do find that I do stop a guest on is like when it comes to opioid overdoses. I mean, if we want to affect real change, I had a couple episodes about the Judge Rotenberg Center about shocking developmentally disabled people. I think their name was Nancy Weiss and then Jan Nisbet. They both wrote a book about it. There's this center that temporarily shut down during COVID, but it's still active today. And it's active because of lobbying within the court systems where the FDA tried to shut them down. And then the FDA was reaching their boundaries of what they could regulate. What happened was there was a video in 2004, a kid was shocked and it's not like electroconvulsive shock. This is a specifically designed electric shock thing by this institution. And when I say it, people say it's conspiracy. The kid was shocked 79 to 143 times on its sides of his temples where he developed 3rd-degree burns and he has it's acute stress disorder. It's called Judge Rotenberg Center. If you Google that, it'll pop up on Wikipedia and it's still going on today. And they're shocking people with developmental disabilities. And what you get is if you're insubordinate, you get a shock. What they call insubordinate is if you groan at getting a shock. If you wince, that's another shock. It's an abuse of power. And these people I talk about, I go, this is stuff you really can affect change. And I'm pretty sure it's in Minnesota. Like I'm 100% positive. So this is something that's going on today. People don't know about because there's a bunch of other topics where people think that tweeting at the president is going to have them make a decision for them, where I just go, there's real things you can affect. Opioid overdoses, 100,000 from the ages of 19 to 43 last year alone. I mean, real things that are happening around you, I think you should be aware of. And we don't talk about these things. And I think that's an important thing to talk about.
Yeah. So I listened to your podcast about the shocks and I saw that video afterwards. I looked it up. So yeah, it's pretty horrendous. I had no idea it was happening. Yeah, did not know that.
But Tom, I really appreciate you giving me your time, man. I like talking to you. I'm glad to have you back on. I'm surprised there was an article though. That was funny. I just found that out today. I was like, wait a minute, that was in March. Holy shit.
Maybe there'll be another one after this. We'll find out. But yeah, thanks a lot. I really appreciate being on your podcast. I'd love to do it again.
I invite the person to write the article to use their full name, use their face and video, and come on to the show.
That would be great. I would love that.
All right. Well, their name was Climate Denial Roundup or something like
I saw that. Yeah.
Not denying shit. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.